Well, it was as close as it was always going to be. Charles Leclerc won the drag from the pole. Max had a little bit of wheel spin off the line, but did pretty well to retain second place going into the first corner. Lewis Hamilton, absolutely fabulous in the Mercedes, crowding Max like crazy, but at the last minute, Max managed to get the run going into turn one. So it was Charles from Max from Lewis, which meant, of course, that Sergio Perez had been displaced from his P3 in the other Red Bulls. So what was it going to be? Was it going to be Max making an early move on Charles, taking advantage of that massive top speed that he has on the Red Bull? Or was it going to be Charles doing what we've seen so many times this year, driving really well in the early laps of the full tank of fuel on the Ferrari and putting anyone behind him in trouble with the heat from the Ferrari and, of course, the heat on the medium tyre on which they all started, or most of them started. And it was hot too. Track temperature went up to just over 60 as they were sitting on the grid. It came down pretty rapidly to 50, but the race started with the track temperature at about 52, 53 degrees. So it was hot. And Max, obviously behind the Ferrari, had to think about that as well. But for the first 8 or 9 laps, one thing was clear. Max Verstappen's Red Bull was not going to suffer the same sort of massive tyre deg that we saw in the Austrian Grand Prix. So looking back to that race now, perhaps it was something in the diffuser, as we've been suggesting all along, or maybe Red Bull just got on top of it, as we kind of predicted they would. The Red Bull looked really, really good on all parts of the circuit. Yes, Charles still had that grip level advantage in Sector 1 on the slower corners, particularly on traction, it looked like. But through Sector 2 and Sector 3, Max was able to stay with Charles and not use all the road. Max got very close when DRS came into play going in to the chicane on the back straight, but Charles just superb under braking. A lot of pressure. When you've got somebody like Verstappen behind with that huge top speed advantage, all you can do in the Ferrari is brake absolutely perfectly. That doesn't necessarily mean braking as late as possible. It means braking at the correct place and at the right rate. And that's what Charles was doing under braking there. Just brilliant to watch. And after 13 laps or so of these two guys going around Ricard, pulling away remorselessly from Lewis Hamilton, who, if you please, was still in front of Sergio Perez, who was still behind Lewis Hamilton. That was a shock. If there was any shock in the early laps of the race, it was Sergio Perez being unable to do anything about Lewis Hamilton in front, and indeed holding position with George Russell behind him. Anyway, back to the front. It's now about lap 13. And indeed, Max's tyres are starting to overheat. So there's no option but to let Charles get away. He drops out of the DRS. And at this point, Red Bull decide to bring Max in. A classic racing decision. If you're stuck in a situation, you can do nothing about it. Bring the guy in for tyres and let's see what happens. So Max came in. Charles Leclerc's out there now leading the Grand Prix by 9-10 seconds from Lewis Hamilton. And the really interesting thing now is going to be what strategy Ferrari are going to use on Leclerc. Probably they're going to try and run him on a one-stop, and probably he's going to do 4 or 5 laps into this stint still. And then almost inexplicably, in the middle of turn 11, a corner in which he's looked sublime, or looked sublime on Friday, got to say, Charles Leclerc lost the Ferrari, lost the rear, and went off into the boondocks. And that was one of the most surprising things I've ever seen, partly because it was Charles Leclerc, and partly because at that stage of the race, he's no longer got anybody in his mirrors. Lewis Hamilton's 6 seconds behind him. Max has gone in for his second set of tyres. This is the moment for Charles Leclerc to be thinking, how many more laps can I get out of this stint? What is the tyre management situation going to be? The car's really quick. I've managed to get through the first 14 laps, whatever it is, without losing the lead. He wasn't relaxing, but it was a moment when finally he could be Charles Leclerc and just drive the way he wanted to drive the car, without having to defend from Max at all. And he lost it in the middle of 11. Let's talk about that, because the entry to 11 is really, really quick. And both of them, as I've been saying all weekend, look superb going in there. But it's in the middle of the corner that is the substance of what this horseshoe is all about, because it's a tightening radius, it's a double apex right, there's a slight camber change as well, it's going downhill slightly. And Max always, in the early phase of the race, when he was behind Charles, and you could watch the two wheel to wheel, Max was always using less road in the middle of the corner. He was perhaps had 18 inches to his left at any given moment when he was preparing the car for the second apex, when he was slowing it down, massaging the steering, doing what he does with the pedals. Whereas Charles was starting to drift more and more to the outside in the middle of this double apex right, almost into Carlos Sainz territory. a very natural place for Carlos Sainz to be, because that is the sort of driver he is. He always turns in a little bit later than Charles Leclerc, as we've been saying all year. He likes to brake in a straight line. He doesn't like to brake as he's turning in. He can do it, but he doesn't like to do it. And here, it was interesting to see Charles more and more to the left of Max Verstappen as they went into the second part of that corner. And in the end, what caught him out was a kerb. He caught the kerb with the left rear, and it spun him round and into the boonies, as I say. Why would he do that? I don't think he can put it down to a lack of concentration because Max is no longer there pressurizing him. I think potentially it's down to this endless comparison of telemetry between the two drivers in the team. But for sure there are places in that turn 11 where Carlos Sainz was looking better than Charles Leclerc. Equally, Charles was probably quicker 100 meters down the road from the exit of turn 11, which doesn't necessarily come under the heading of the telemetry for that corner. And if they were micromanaging Charles into having a higher minimum speed mid-corner, turn 11, potentially that would only have happened if he had started to move to the left a bit more and given himself a bit more approach into the second apex, so he could just get the car nicely stopped and then go in with the power. Whereas what he was doing was going in to a very early apex, just beautiful turn in on the brakes, just like Max Verstappen. And I wonder whether he was out of his comfort zone come race day. I mean, you may think, what's Windsor on about, that Charles Leclerc doesn't know how to drive and doesn't know exactly what he's doing at any given moment? Well, my response is, if everything was perfect and the driver always knew what to do, he wouldn't be looking at the telemetry of the other driver at all, and the team wouldn't be spoon-feeding into to him either. And all it takes for a driver like Leclerc is to see that Carlos Sainz has got, 2-3 mile an hour, kilometre an hour minimum speed advantage in the middle of 11, and he's going to start looking at ways to achieve that and to match that himself. He just looked to be very unnatural through there. He looked to be on the edge as well throughout the lap compared with Max, got to say. So, put all that together and you got Charles Leclerc going off into whoop whoop and out of the race. He will think he's made a mistake, and he's absolutely right. I put that down to Ferrari having a guy like Carlos Sainz, who's a very different style of driver in the other car, and he's very, very quick as well, and he's very politically adept. And I think all of that, as I've been saying all year, is starting to pile up in terms of subliminally affecting Charles Leclerc. And I think that mistake today was a function of that. And it's the sort of thing you'd never see happening with Max, not partly because he's Max, but not necessarily, but because he's Max. It's because the guy in the other car is Sergio Perez. Yeah, and occasionally, in terms of traction and putting the power down really well, Max can look at Sergio and learn a few things. But it's not a constant pressure of comparing the two all the time, which is what is going on at Ferrari. I don't know. It's a strange one, and ultimately you just got to put it down to driver error, and you got to say there's no point in over-analysing it. But for me, this is a symptom of the 2022 Formula One season and the absolute obsession with numbers and telemetry and driver comparisons within the team, which is why it's absolutely critical, in my view, always to have a balanced team as distinct from the two best drivers you can possibly get. And that, of course, puts the spotlight on George Russell joining Mercedes alongside Lewis Hamilton. Lewis had a superb day today, but George Russell did what George Russell has always done throughout his career. Super aggressive. If there's a gap, he will go for it. And as we saw in his GP3 days, if it means almost T-boning your teammate, he doesn't mind at all. That's George Russell. And if you don't want that sort of driver in the Mercedes team, you don't hire a George Russell. You hire somebody who's much more, you keep Valtteri Bottas. This, of course, left Max Verstappen out. There was a safety car, so everybody came in. Luckily for Max, he'd been in only 2 laps before, so his tyres were still effectively new. But it now meant that he had Lewis Hamilton behind him, who in turn was leading Sergio Perez and George Russell. Everybody now on fresh, hard tyres going through to the end of the race. I'll talk about Carlos Sainz in a minute. George Russell finished third, but it was an eventful third for him. He wasn't as quick as Lewis today, or let me rephrase that. Lewis was sublimely quick today in the Mercedes, notably turn 11, but in other places as well. Because he was on his own, I don't think TV viewers saw much of what Lewis was doing today, but he was absolutely superb in the car with very few mistakes. There was one moment when he ran a little bit wide, and this, in his 300th Grand Prix start, Lewis was all over Max as they're warming up the tyres for the restart when the safety car was about to come in, and you thought, wow, Lewis is thinking win here, he can do something. Well, he did finish second, absolutely superb. In the laps immediately after the restart, as the tyres were coming up to temperature, Lewis was more or less able to match the laps that Max was putting in. Don't forget, of course, that Max at this point is thinking, got to finish the race, got to look after the car, look after the tyres, look after the engine, look after the fuel, look after everything. So for sure, he was not on anything like his own limit. But nonetheless, Lewis was not going to go away. If Max was going to do something like a 37.9 at this stage of the race as a base lap time that should enable him to pull out a gap, Lewis would counter that sometimes with a 37.8 or perhaps a 38.0. He did not go away. And given the differences in top speed between those two cars, that was some sort of driving by Lewis Hamilton. Let me give you an example. Lap 39, just plucking a lap, when both of them were not in a DRS zone at all, not lapping slower cars, nothing like that. Max Verstappen through the trap 320, Lewis through the trap 302. Just move the numerals around a little bit. Massive difference. And yet Lewis on the lap was losing maybe 1-2 tenths a lap and putting it in consistently as well. Repeat the point, Max nothing like on his own limit, but consider how well Lewis was driving in the Mercedes to maintain the gap that he did to Max. Yes, it expanded from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, but it wasn't 18, it was 6. It was really impressive from Lewis Hamilton. And to emphasize the point of how far Max was off his own potential pace, let's look now at Carlos Sainz, who, as we know, started from the back of the grid. He started logically on the hard tyre. Virtually everybody around him was on the medium. Kevin Magnussen did the same thing. Actually, Kevin made an amazing start, picked up about 6 places on the opening lap, but then immediately ran into trouble. Shame for him after all that homework he put in yesterday, as I said. But Carlos was really good, drove through the field. He's on the hard tyre. He made the tyres last. And when, of course, the safety car came out, that was his cue to switch to the medium tyre. So he was really quick at this point. And he passed more and more cars and got to within 8-9 seconds of Max Verstappen. And that, of course, is what Red Bull were looking at in terms of Max's pace. There was the 2 Mercedes, there was Sergio there, Checo, his teammate, but there was also Carlos Sainz in the other Ferrari. That was a threat that they could never ignore. So it's now lap 30, and the gap between Max and Carlos Sainz is about 8 seconds. And now Carlos is right behind George Russell, who is lying 4th. He has a few goes into the chicane, he's all over him, and as they come out of the chicane on the back straight, he's right in the toe and then pulls to the left. This is George Russell we're talking about here. This isn't just some racing guy, this is George Russell. He pulls to the left of George. George stays absolutely on it going into scene, and Carlos now is on the outside, gives George room, amazing, stays on the outside of scene and passes him on the outside of scene flat out in 8th gear. Serious overtake. Okay, he's on the medium tyre. Nonetheless, this was an amazing bit of driving, I thought, by Carlos Sainz. Really impressive to see how aggressive he was against a driver like George. Let's just repeat that point. This wasn't Sergio Perez who was doing it to. And that, therefore, left Carlos in P4. So his next victim was going to be Checo Perez in the Red Bull. And very quickly, 10 laps later, he found a great way past him. He hounded him out of 11, was all over him on those 2 or 3 quick lefts, and then put himself on the outside going into the second last corner, which is a left-hander. He's on the outside and then just dives down the inside. This is what Jody Scheckter and Ronnie Peterson tried to do to one another in the 73 French Grand Prix, and it ended in tears. This time, Carlos pulled the move off perfectly, and now he was up to P3. Of course, he was on the medium tyre, and there's quite a lot of debate at this point as to whether he was going to need to stop again, how much life there was in the tyre. And at one point, Carlos said, yeah, maybe we should come in and throw the dice. And then he said, no, let me go for it. And he did this amazing pass. And just as he's done the pass, they come on the radio and said, Carlos, in for new tyres. He went ballistic, of course, as you would. But of course, there was no way of avoiding the reality that the medium tyre was going off. And if he was going to finish the race with any sort of competitive speed, Carlos was going to need to come in again for another set of mediums. Which brings me back to my point of how far off his own personal pace Max Verstappen was. Because on that new set of mediums, Carlos then set fastest lap of the race, which was a 35.7. So you're looking at about 2 seconds off. Okay, it was a new set of tyres, but the cars were lighter now, there was more grip on the track. So Max was looking, he was probably running at least a second off his own pace throughout the race. You did allow yourself the luxury of thinking maybe on his last lap, Max would now respond to Carlos. But this was a day when I think he was very, very happy to have won the Grand Prix, because so many things could have gone wrong. Charles, of course, could have won this race quite easily. And equally, we saw in Austria how little things can upset the balance on that Red Bull. We saw that in qualifying as well. And so you could say the race ran out, but of course it didn't, because George Russell is an incredible racing driver, with emphasis on the word racing. Put that word in italics, bold, whatever you want to do. Because when Carlos Sainz was doing his stuff with Sergio Perez, there was George Russell watching the two of them and gaining ground again and catching Perez completely by surprise. Once Sainz had done and going into that last corner the previous lap, here's George now right on Perez again and going inside him, going into the back chicane. And the two touched. There was no action taken. I think that's absolutely the correct decision. George was absolutely convinced he was in front. Sergio thought that George had taken him out. A virtual safety car came out with just a couple of laps to go when Guanyu Zhou stopped his Alpha. George did what he did. He was absolutely totally on the ball and just got the run on Perez. You don't actually see that very often, because the teams are radioing the drivers saying, get ready, the virtual safety car is going to stop. But whether or not Red Bull got it wrong, unlike Red Bull to get it wrong, but there was some radio message later on to Sergio saying, sorry, they kept the virtual safety car out longer than they should. You know, when you think about what happened in Abu Dhabi last year, incredible that Red Bull would say something like that on the radio now. Anyway, putting that to one side, it was a great pass by George. He was just ready to go. As soon as the virtual safety car was dismissed, whatever the word is, cancelled, he just got the run on Perez. He didn't really look as if he knew what was going on. And I think that kind of summed up Sergio Perez's day. In a car that Max Verstappen won this Grand Prix with ease, admittedly once Charles Leclerc had ended up in the tyre wall, Sergio Perez only finished fourth, beaten by both Mercedes drivers. Fernando Alonso drove really well in the Alpine to finish 6th, Esteban Ocon 8th, so Alpine 6th and 8th, McLaren 7th and 9th. So again, honours to Alpine. Very good job for the French-owned team, British-based of course, French engine in front of the French crowd. Really good drive by Fernando. Didn't see much of him, but there was a moment when they were telling him that Lando Norris behind him was starting to catch, and Fernando said, yeah, I know, I want him to get a bit near me so I can get him to destroy his tyres. Classic Fernando Alonso. And that's exactly what happened. He did a really good job, managed the race really well. So Fernando Alonso, I think one of the great drives of that French Grand Prix. Won't get a lot of accolades, probably lost in everything else that happened with Charles and Carlos Sainz and George Russell. But I think Fernando drove really well too. I thought the best response on the radio today, without any doubt at all, was from Lando Norris when they got on the radio and said something like, this is towards the end when Carlos is on his new set of mediums. They said, the driver behind you, Carlos Sainz, he's on new mediums, but you're racing for position, Lando. And he said, yeah, right. Brilliant. Anyway, there we are. French Grand Prix at Ricard. Next weekend, the Hungarian Grand Prix at the Hungaroring. Looking forward to that. See you then.